response. One of the things I kind of want to follow up on is, as we kind of move into education, the conversation about education, one of the things that I came across in researching for Black History Month this month, I was talking to Dr. Frederick there at Howard University a couple of weeks ago, did a sit-down interview with him, and he talked about fundraising and the different challenges that we have there at historical Black colleges and universities as it relates to funding, as it relates to our relevancy. Are we relevant? And one of the things that came up in my research there, Rev Aaron Wade, they talked about in the African American community, some of the reasons why we don't receive a lot of funds from the alumni base is because 10% of our funds go to the African American churches. So that's kind of like a myth that's kind of out there. Like, hey, 10%, people give 10% to their church, and regards, sometimes the historical Black colleges and universities kind of go lax because people are invested in their church as their charity versus giving back to institution of higher learning. One of the things I want to talk about as we go into education, how do we build those partnerships that, if that is truly the case, that a lot of African Americans don't feel like they should give back to their HBCU or their money is tied up into the church. How do we build those partnerships, collaborations where we're able to kind of go across the board to work together to educate people why it's so important to give back to that historical Black college and university or into an education in general, and how do that historical Black college and university also work with the church, the nonprofit, being that, if that is the case, of the mindset of our community. And I kind of wanted to kind of segue into that, to kind of get your thoughts on that as it relates to education, as it relates to funding. A lot of times people think that the funding is cut, a lot of the Black charity money is caught up in our Black churches.
I'll say I wish that was the case. Right. If we could really get our members to honestly tithe, I think one, the church could do so much more. And one, if you're at a church that has a consciousness around social justice and community orientation, and money is not just staying in that church and being about that church, we can do so much more in the community. I don't think folks are honestly tithing, if we're going to be real. Folks give, but I don't think folks honestly give a 10% for churches that prescribe to that way of giving. So I think that's a myth. Now, there are some folks that do tithe, and I think that that's a very good thing. I think that it's imperative that folks take a holistic approach, right? Folks have to understand that they are a part of a larger whole. I think so often we see ourselves as, this is mine, it's about me, it's I'm at the center of the world, and what we don't get is our responsibilities for the various avenues that supported us, the various avenues that supported the plight of Black people, the plight of where we come from. And so I tithe, but I also make it a responsibility to give to other things, while I also take care of my responsibilities with my bills and everything else like that. That goes back to being taught how to be a good manager of my resources. So often the priorities of folks are around, let me drive the hottest car, let me have the rock the hottest shoes, and that becomes the center, the priority, and instead of putting the resources in the various avenues, you know, we get sidetracked to look at things that we want to make us feel good and deal with issues that we need to really look at and deal with. So I think if you are tithing, I think it's important that you also make sure that your institution that you're tithing into gives back also, or tithe outside of the church to another institution, so that we can keep this cycle of resources and support going. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it does answer my question. It does answer the question, but I also want to talk about, because we're talking about solutions, we're talking about, you know, what can we do to be able to build those better relationships. So I want to know, for people that that's going to watch this, how do you build those relationships to be able to leverage that partnership? Because I think sometimes when we look at, if I educate my people and I tell my church that historical Black colleges and universities are, you know, struggling today, we need to give back. How do we build those partnerships where we're not saying, okay, I need to keep my mega church going, so I'm not going to encourage my people to give to the historical Black college and university. So when I talk to presidents of universities, that's one of the things that they say that they struggle with the most, is leveraging those partnerships in their communities with people of influence like the church to be able to offset some of that foundational money that they need. So how do you build those relationships? How do we do that?
I think coming from a student perspective, I feel like a lot of that starts when you are a student at your HBCU. Giving back starts when you're a student. I think a lot of times there's this misconception that, oh, I'll give back to my institution when I make it big. A lot of us are still waiting to make it big. Like, we'll never make it to the big enough that we feel like we can just throw dollars at our institution. I feel like it has to start when you're a student, because then it becomes a habitual act. You then consistently give. You give as a freshman, and you don't have to give $100,000. You give $50 if you have it over the course of a year, over the course of a school year, excuse me. So you give that as a freshman, as a sophomore, throughout your matriculation at your institution, and then once you become an alum of that institution, it's second nature. And so then, like Rev Wade said, you're able to manage those resources. You have the money that you can give to your HBCU, you have the money that you can give to your church, you have the money that you can give to send your kids to a great school, give them a proper education, and continue to be a great steward over your resources. I feel like that's a great opportunity, but I feel like a lot of it starts in conversation with President Frederick. He'll tell you a lot of the conversation, a lot of the giving needs to start when you are a student. It becomes easier. It's very difficult once you become a graduate of an institution and you have loans to pay back and you have bills to pay. Then it becomes very difficult to kind of light a fire in you to say, I want to give back to my institution now that I have all of these things to take care of. It's about when you are a student, taking care of your institution while you're there and being a good steward of the resources while you are there, to be able to create that habitual act of giving back to those institutions that matter to you, not just your school, but your church, your community, and a lot of other institutions that continue to build you and your community up.
I think I have to disagree with the premise of the question. And again, I'm coming from, sometimes what you believe is based upon where you're from in life. I grew up in the town of Capitol Heights. I went to an HBCU. I did go to a majority law school, but I represent criminal defendants, and I work in a more urban environment. And so I am very hard on what I believe to be my people, right? And what I see as being, I don't think people are tithing so much that they can't provide. It is a belief that, and maybe it's not a conscious belief, but it's a fact.
Excuse me, can you hold my phone?
I'm sorry. I think it's a fact that education just is not a priority. I watch, and I think it begins even before being in college. I sit there and watch the students in my community. I sit there, I go to the schools and just sit there and I watch them. And they are failing. They're absolutely failing. E's, D's, and everything else. I see no parents coming to the class. But what I do see is they are wearing the brightest shoes. I mean, they are sitting there talking about, what are those? If you don't have the best and the newest. I had to even break down, my boys, they're here, and they did not have cell phones. I felt pressured to get them cell phones because I thought we were together people and not giving these kids the phones. But apparently I was in the minority. And so I had to get my kids phones because everyone else had phones. And I had to look at myself and say, if I can afford to pay this $50 per phone and get them the Jordans that they're asking for and so forth, because it is so socially not acceptable in the inner beltway, right, or in the urban communities. But I had to check myself about the priorities, because when I get that letter from University of Maryland Eastern Shore asking for some money and I'm thinking I don't have it, I did have it. I just did not use it in a proper fashion. I kind of was sucked into something that I know, as an educated professional, I know it doesn't matter. I know what my kids' shoes don't matter, but they may get teased now, but that's a small thing compared to when they get into the general world. No one's going to care what kind of shoes. Well, maybe they still might, to be honest. But the point is, I disagree with the premise that people are tithing so much.
Right.
I think people make choices that affects not applying their income to their HBCUs or to other sources. So.
Right, you make a very, very good